Well, good evening, and welcome to our Wednesday night midweek Bible study. We've been studying 1 Corinthians, and we've been in chapter 7. We're going to conclude the first part of Paul's argument, his response to a letter from the Corinthians. We're going to continue with verses 6 and 7 tonight out of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So it's good to have you with us this evening for the study. I'm excited about this coming Sunday. We're going to have two in-person services at 9 and 11 here at New Life Church, and looking forward to seeing those of you who will be out for those. All right, well, our study tonight, from the first verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we know that the Apostle Paul was answering some specific questions and correcting some errant doctrinal behavior positions that some of the Corinthian believers had taken. Within the context of marriage, some of the believers in Corinth held to the position, it is better not to touch a woman. And this was in marriage. In other words, some in the church deemed it more spiritual to abstain from sex within the marriage covenant. And they thought, again, we talked about this before, because they thought they'd reached the spiritual existence of angelic beings, that they didn't need to have any sexual intimacy anymore in their relationships with their spouses. So in verses 1 through 7, Paul addressed this issue, and he addressed it directly. In verse 2, Paul stated that in marriage, the man has full sexual rights with his wife and the woman with her husband. He's very clear about that. Paul clearly stated those rights of intimacy were mutual between the two. Then in verse 3, Paul declared that sexual intimacy in marriage was and is a duty. It is a mutual responsibility within marriage. In verse 4, Paul wrote that a wife doesn't have sole authority over her body in her marriage, and neither does the husband. In marriage, each spouse has a joint right in regards to the other in intimacy. In verse 5, the married Corinthians are told to stop, just told flat out, stop depriving of one another. And Paul gave a reason, because it opens the door to Satan, to temptation, and to a lack of self-control. Also, in verse 5, abstinence was and is only to be temporary. It is to be, if abstinence is done at all in the marriage covenant, it is to be mutually agreed upon, consensual with both parties, and always with a purpose. For instance, a time of focused prayer. Now we're going to go on and see the conclusion of this argument in the next two verses, Paul's concluding remarks concerning abstinence in the marriage relationship. Now, again, just to get a better understanding as we go through this evening, to get a better understanding of verses 6 and 7, let's go ahead and take a look back at verse 5, a verse we closed last week's teaching with. Let's look quickly at verse 5. Paul wrote, "Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So there in this verse, there is a command given, then an exception. An exception. Now keep those things in mind as we go on. Our title for tonight's teaching is Different Gifts. Different gifts. Speaking of different gifts, let's look at some different ways of translating verse 6. It's a very short verse, but let's go ahead and look at some different translations. First, the New American Standard. "But this I say," in Paul's writing, "but this I say by way of concession, not of command." The Amplified Classic, "But I am saying this more as a matter of permission and concession, not as a command or regulation." The CEV, "In my opinion, this is what should be done, though I don't know of anything the Lord said about this matter." The CJB translation, "I am giving you this as a suggestion, not a command." Now, some translations, of the scriptures, as they begin to translate, they're not only doing a straight translation from the Greek, but they're giving their own interpretation. And sometimes that can be off. It can be errant. And we need to be aware of that. And that's why it's good to look at different translations and do personal study. But for instance, the Living Bible doesn't just translate, but gives an interpretation. And what I believe is a wrong one at that. Look at 1 Corinthians 7:6 in the Living Bible. I'm not saying you must marry, but you certainly may if you wish. And bringing the fact of marriage right into that there in the text. Now, we can look at Eugene Peterson. In his paraphrase, the Message gives the essence of the context, I believe, in his translation. But again, a little bit of interpretation here. He writes, I'm not, understand, commanding these periods of abstinence, only providing my best counsel if you should choose them. Now, I believe Eugene's very, very close to the whole meaning of the whole passage with his paraphrase there. The NCV translation, I say this to give you permission to stay away from sexual relations for a time. It is not a command to do so. Again, I believe this is the spirit, of the actual Greek grammar and the wording that's being brought out. The NOG, what I have just said is not meant as a command, but as a suggestion. All right. Well, let's look at this verse, and then we're going to look at verse 7. Let's break it down, and let's see exactly what the Apostle Paul is saying, what his intent is to the Corinthians. He begins, but this I say, with the pronoun this, in the emphatic position. What we mean by that, in the Greek language, when you put something first in the sentence, that's in the emphatic position. Well, that's what we see here. Tuto de lego. And tuto is a demonstrative pronoun. Again, it's put first there. Translated this, and refers to a subject that has immediately preceded it. So keep that in mind. It's a subject that has immediately preceded it. The question is, what did Paul just say? What did he just say? What immediately preceded this statement? What is he saying by way of concession? Now, by way of concession, in verse 6, Paul inserts into the argument that what has just been said is a concession to them. That word concession is the Greek word SUGGNOMEN, and it means, well, it only occurs, first of all, it only occurs here in the whole New Testament, but the word actually means to have an attitude of lenience, to be indulgent towards someone or something. Now, some look at this phrase as Paul apologizing for having to share these personal details about marital intimacy. Some actually interpret it that way, that when he's saying by way of concession here, that he's apologizing for bringing up the subject of sexual relationships within marriage. Others say that the whole argument from verse 2 through 5 is the concession. In other words, sex and marriage. That was not, he wasn't commanding anything. He was just giving his counsel to them, but not a command. So they're saying that Paul here is saying that all that was his opinion, and it's really up to the couples in marriage, because that's a counsel and not a command. Others, many others throughout history, believe that Paul's teaching was indeed about marriage and sex in general. And so that interpretation, which has been prominent in church history, is that Paul was making a concession to those who just can't be single and who can't be celibate, and that the whole marriage and sexual intimacy in marriage is a concession. They believe that Paul has said in verse 1, not the Corinthians, but Paul said, it is better not to touch a woman. But what is Paul really saying here in verse 6? What is the context? And again, we've been going through this in the last few weeks, so you understand exactly what's going on. But what is the proper context? What is the concession? What is the permission that Paul is giving? Paul's concession to the Corinthians was this: you can, but you do not have to, abstain from sex during a time of fasting and prayer as a married couple. Paul had just given that concession, that exception, that permission in verse 5. Paul had just told the Corinthians, you can practice abstinence, okay. You can practice abstinence if you want to in marriage. That's the concession. But only if it is mutually agreed upon. Paul's saying, I'm going to concede to you that there may be times when abstinence within marriage is appropriate, but it's only within these strict boundaries. The concession is what, again, verse 5 just claimed, which agrees, again, with all the Greek grammar and the wording that Paul is using. Paul is saying, if you're going to abstain from sexual intimacy in marriage, then let it be a mutual decision for a specific purpose like prayer and within a set limit of time. It's temporary. But even that, Paul is saying now in verse 6, is a concession to you. It's not a command. As with so much else, this sentence is especially difficult for those who hold the views that make verse 1, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, that make it Paul's statement and a preference of celibacy over sex in marriage. Or the view that all of verse 2 to 5 are just Paul's counsel and not his commands, and that Paul was embarrassed to bring up the subject of intimacy in such detail, and he was literally saying, excuse me, I'm sorry that I had to bring this up. The problems with the marriage in general view, marriage is the concession to celibacy. The problems with that are several. Just let me give you a couple of them tonight. Number one, it makes the this I say jump over the one certain concession in the whole passage. It's just like it leaps over that and then goes backward. And again, the one certain concession in verse 5, introduced by the prepositional phrase translated except by, or some translate that unless perhaps, it jumps all the way back over that, like to verse 2, speaking of marriage and sexual intimacy in general. So there's a big problem with that. It doesn't agree with the grammar. Another problem with making this jump is the fact that, number 2, Paul has used the language of command all the way through, up to verse 5. Verse 2, verse 3, verse 5 are all present imperatives and function as commands to those within marriage, within the present context. Verse 2 was a command. Each man is to have his own wife. And to have is a present imperative command. And have means there to be sexually intimate with your wife and no other, and vice versa. Verse 3, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise the wife also to her husband. Must fulfill, that is a present imperative. It is a command. Verse 5, really the main command of the whole passage here, this whole first 7 verses, is stop depriving one another. And that is again, a present imperative, a command. Paul has been given commands all throughout verses 2 to 5 until he used those words in verse 5, except by or unless perhaps. As throughout the paragraph, the ordinary sense of Paul's words in their immediate context offers the best understanding of the whole, not only the sentence, but the whole paragraph. The Corinthians letter had argued for abstinence from sexual relations within marriage, verse 1, to which Paul, in verses 2 to 5, responded with an emphatic no, no, no way. Sexual abstinence in marriage leads to a lack of self-control. He brought that out at the end of verse 5. And the Greek word there was AKRASIA, which means being mastered by the lust of the flesh, a lack of restraints. AKRASIA describes one who does not have their desires, emotions under control, but is instead, you're controlled by your desires or your lust. The AKRASIA, lack of self-control in verse 5, and then of course you go back to verse 2, and the porneia, the sexual immoralities of verse 2, those are part of the reasons, on top of God's design for marriage, why Paul commanded the Corinthians in response to their letter to stop depriving them, one another or defrauding one another. And then Paul adds the concession clause. Unless perhaps there's a temporary abstinence by mutual consent at set times for prayer. But it's a concession. It is not a command. And that's what the verse said, not of command. The temporary period of abstinence is not a command. Not a command, not by way of an order. That's what the Greek phrase means. It's not by way of an order, not by way of a command. You see, the person or persons ordered to do something do not have any choice. They don't have any choice in the matter. There is not the freedom to exercise any personal judgment because you're under orders. Here, however, Paul has just given the Corinthians not an order, not a command, but a concession about abstinence in marriage. Okay. You're going to be abstinent in marriage. You can do that for a short period of time, set time, if it's mutually agreed upon, and if there's a godly purpose for it. But again, even for prayer, not having sexual intimacy, that's not a command. Sexual intimacy in marriage and prayer are not mutually exclusive. I am sure many married couples pray during sex, but we're not going to go into that tonight. Okay? Paul was saying to the Corinthians, your prayers are not hindered by regular sexual relations in marriage. The two are not mutually exclusive. But if you want to abstain during that time, that's okay. That'll keep you more focused. That's okay. That is the only concession that I'm going to give you to the command, stop depriving one another. Each of you should have your own spouse, and each of you should fulfill your duty. So, with all the difficulties that already had persisted in the Corinthian church over this matter, Paul was not going to even suggest that a temporary time of abstinence was a command, or suggest that it was a more spiritual thing to do. The matter of sexual abstinence did not belong to the category marked married. It belongs to the category marked single. And for those called to be married and those called to be single, each of them had a specific, different gift and gifting. That's what we see in verse 7. Let's look at that. Paul begins, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself. However, each has his own gift from God, one in this way and another in that. Very interesting. The classic, the Amplified Classic version. I wish that all men were like I myself am in this matter of self-control. But each has his own special gift from God, one of this kind and one of another. The CSB version. I wish that all people were as I am. Each has his own gift from God. One person has this gift, another has that. The ERV. I wish everyone could be like me. But God has given each person a different ability. He makes some able to live one way, others to live a different way. The ISB. I would like everyone to be unmarried, like I am. However, each person has a special gift from God, one this and another that. I like Eugene Peterson in the Message translation, as he puts it this way. Sometimes I wish everyone were single like me, a simpler life in many ways. But celibacy is not for everyone any more than marriage is. God gives the gift of the single life to some, the gift of the married life to others. The New Living Translation reads this way. But I wish everyone were single just as I am, yet each person has a special gift from God, one of one kind or another. And lastly, in the Passion Translation, I would wish that all of you could live unmarried just as I do, yet I understand that we are all decidedly different, with each having a special grace for one thing or another. Now, let's break that down. The first sentence here in verse 7 is so important for us to understand in a proper interpretation of this, not only this passage, but I believe for the chapter. Let's look at it again. Paul said, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. He begins with this phrase, yet I wish. Thelos de pantos, or pantos. Thelos literally means I could wish. And this I could wish, that explained in detail, like in Thayer's Greek concordance. Very important to understand the use of the infinitive there, and that's brought out if you want to do some more study on that. Literally, I could wish now that, and then the word pantos. And that word means every single person was as I myself am. Now that's a lot of wording, and I'm trying to explain the Greek there, but pantos, all, is a word that refers to the individuals within a totality. In other words, it refers to each one of the sum total, every one of the total. So really what this phrase says, literally in the Greek, is, I could wish now that every one of you was as I myself am. Now, with that understanding of the Greek in the context, I like the TPT translation, the Passion Translation. I would wish that all of you could live unmarried just as I do. Or Eugene Peterson, sometimes I wish everyone were single like me. What's he meaning there? Sometimes I just wish, I could wish that everyone was like me. Well, what was Paul? He was single and celibate. He was single and he had the gift of celibacy. He was not fighting the issues of AKRASIA, of a lack of self-control, or porneia. This reflection on his own status is best explained if the Corinthians themselves had indeed appealed to Paul in making their case for abstinence in marriage. But Paul, he's being very clear here, he's not identifying with the Corinthians in their marriage abstinence, but he's placing himself now in sharp contrast to them. And he qualified his singleness and being celibate in terms of having a completely different spiritual gift and call upon his life. What is important here is knowing what Paul, again, is referring to in wishing, again, that all people were like him. Many interpreters read this as a wish on Paul's part that people did not have to ever get married at all. But understand, if that was Paul's intent, for all to be single or to be celibate, he would have been going against God's divine plan for humanity, for marriage among people, the institution of marriage. And he would have been against babies and having more babies. Paul wasn't against marriage or sex within marriage. Paul was simply contrasting his gift, the gift of celibacy, with the alternate gift given to the married Corinthians. Different giftings. Think of the context and what Paul was saying, as I myself am. How was Paul? What was his condition? Single, celibate. Single and celibate. That was Paul's direct purpose and gifting from the Lord. So, Paul's saying, I could wish now that every single person had my calling and gifting, but that would fly, because he's going to use the word however. What he's saying, I could wish that, but that would fly in the face of reality. That would fly in the face of God's design. That's not what this is all about. This is why Paul said, again, however, and why he went into this next phrase. Look at it. However, each has his own gift from God, one in this way and another in that. Paul was single. He had the gift of celibacy. Paul was celibate in celibacy's truest sense. Not referring to merely being single. After all, many are celibate because they are single, but they are not married, but they wish that they were otherwise. But that's not what Paul's saying. Instead, Paul is referring to that singular gift of freedom from the desire or need of sexual fulfillment that made it possible for him to live without marriage in the first place. In other words, the ability to stay single and celibate and serve God apart from marriage. That is a gift. Not only to be single, but the gift to be celibate. Paul and some others had this gift, but not everyone has that gift. The gift of celibacy is the ability to remain unmarried without the need for sex outside of marriage. The purpose is to serve God according to His plan for your specific life. Now, we have seen in the Roman Catholic Church that some who have taken actual vows of celibacy do not have the gift of celibacy and thus do not remain celibate. By the way, celibacy, whether you have the gift of celibacy or not, is always required outside of marriage. So in other words, if you are single, and how many of you know all of us are single at some point in our life? If you are single without the gift of celibacy, you are to walk in obedience until married and not engage in sexual immorality. So we can never use the excuse, I just don't have the gift of celibacy. And we can't use that as an excuse to sin. Again, we're all single at some point in our lives. Sex within marriage between one man and one woman, or celibate singleness. Those are really the only two options. Those are the only two options for Christian people. If you are single, pray for the gift of celibacy. If celibacy is not your gift, you're still to resist temptation and remain celibate out of obedience to God. And of course, you can be praying all that time according to God's will for a spouse and the blessing of the gift of marriage. Paul recognizes that his celibacy was a charisma. In other words, a grace gift. And it's a grace gift for those called to be single, not for those who are married. See, he's showing the contrast here. This places the whole question of the Corinthians and the wrong doctrine of the Corinthians on an entirely different plane than that of Paul and his gifting. The Corinthians were urging celibacy for the married using Paul's situation as a part of their reasoning. Paul says, absolutely not. No way. Celibacy is for the celibate, and as such, it is strictly a matter of charisma. It's specifically a grace gift from God Himself. Such gifts cannot be required across the board for everyone, especially since marriage is an entirely different gifting and calling. That is brought out by the phrase, one in this way, Paul's way, and another in that, being marriage. In context, the conclusion is that a sexual life in marriage is the gift or a gift of another kind. Understand, a gift of another kind, not celibate. The whole argument, therefore, is summed up in these final words. This reference to his own situation causes Paul to reflect on others who are single, but perhaps without the gift of celibacy. That is what verses 8 and 9 are all about. So it's important to understand the whole context of what's going on. We're going to look at verses 8 and 9 next week as he addresses that. What about people who are single but do not have the gift of celibacy? What we have looked at this evening in the last few weeks, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 7, that passage has suffered much in the church, partly because people have approached this text with an agenda much different than the Apostle Paul's, and thus the interpretation and the application of it suffers greatly. Proper interpretation has been deflected away from Paul's intent, which is that of addressing the Corinthians' problem and telling them no in regards to celibacy within marriage. To questions about marriage itself, and especially whether marriage might be a less spiritual calling than celibacy, Paul says no. For Paul, both marriage and celibacy are gifts. And despite his own preference for his gift, Paul does not raise it to a higher spirituality. Again, he's not going to have anything to do with the Corinthians' errant doctrine. He's bringing correction. He's bringing a proper look at both giftings. To raise celibacy to a higher form of spirituality, like the church even now has been doing for years, for centuries, that flies in the face of the text itself and, of course, the intent of the Apostle Paul. The real point of the text, the abusing of sexual relationships within marriage, needs especially to be heard, I believe, today in the church itself. Since the Apostle Paul, by the Spirit, can be very forthright in this matter, we should also be. So let's understand a couple principles here tonight, for us today. Number one, we need to affirm the biblical view of sexual relations within marriage as a corrective to some who still follow Augustine and treat sexuality itself as a part of the fall. In other words, understand, God made us the way we are. God made us sexual creatures, and because God has made us within marriage, designed all that for marriage, sex is good then. Within Christian marriage, sexual intimacy is the most intimate celebration of a life together in Christ Jesus. Another thing that needs to be heard is this. Number two, we need to affirm the mutuality of sexual relations within marriage itself. Too many still treat sex as though it were the privilege of the husband and the duty of the wife. But that's not so. That's not what Paul teaches. Sexual intimacy is the privilege and duty of both together. Each belongs mutually one to the other. In sexual intercourse, as nowhere else, husbands and wives symbolically express their unity and mutuality. Finally, as we've seen in verse 5, about depriving one another, being celibate in marriage is not a matter of being spiritual and holding back of sexual relationships as a means of manipulation within the marriage relationship is absolutely wrong. Depriving one another in the context of marriage abuses God's design for sexuality and God's design in marriage overall. It destroys mutual love and it destroys mutual respect. These are lessons that we need to learn in our day. I read an article where a pastor was telling about how years ago, a friend of his named John was meeting with a group of young men. John was the only married man at that time amongst this group, and the rest of the group were dabbling in pornography. In a moment of brutal honesty, one of them said to John, "I just don't understand how you can have sex with the same woman all the time. That seems so boring." Without hesitation, John said with an absolutely straight face, "I don't have sex with the same woman all the time." Their silent stares begged for explanation. And then John explained. He explained that his wife was not the same woman that he had married. She was always growing. She was always changing as a woman. And he was always growing and maturing as a man. They were not the same people they were when they had gotten married, and neither was their sexual intimacy. They and their intimacy had matured over time. And God had used their marriage union, every area of their marriage, to grow them spiritually, to mature them emotionally, and to make them more and more like Jesus Christ. That is the place of sexual intimacy within marriage. We are not, therefore, to deprive one another. Let's pray tonight. Would you bow your heads with me there at home, and let's pray for God's best. Lord, you are the one who designed marriage. You design sexual behavior, intimacy within marriage. And Lord, you designed it with a purpose. Lord, that unity and that closeness and that growing together and, as a couple. But also, Lord, you've designed that as a means for couples to grow in their emotions, to mature in their Christ-likeness. So, Lord, I pray for every marriage. Lord, that you would have your grace upon every home, upon every marriage. That people would be, married couples would be functioning with the grace and the good behavior in every area, including sexuality in their home. Lord, that your hand of grace would be upon everyone there. And Lord, as we go into the subject of being single and celibacy, Lord, you would teach us and instruct us, and we would always know your specific giftings that you've given us and how to live them out. Because everything you call us to do, you always give us the grace, Lord. You always give us the power. You always show us the way. So, Lord, in these areas, we ask for your leading and guidance. Speak to us, Holy Spirit, tonight. Help us to be better husbands. Help us to be better wives. Help us to be the people you created us to be. In your precious name, Jesus. Amen. I want to thank you for tuning in on our midweek Bible study as we're going through 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Again, next week we're looking at addressing verses 8 to 9 and the subject of singleness without celibacy and how Paul looks at that. All right, God bless you, and hope to see you this Sunday. Goodbye and God bless.